Elena, you studied for 2 summers with Frank McCourt at the Southampton Writers' Conference. How did that experience shape the writing of your memoir, A Mountain of Crumbs? And also tell us a little about that memoir.
I think somewhere in the back of my mind that maybe it was a memoir, or maybe part of it was a memoir. But of course it's easier to hide behind fiction. And Frank McCourt told me at some point in his workshop that it was a memoir. So of course he told me what it was, he gave me permission, sort of allowed me to continue writing it, to feel this authority. After I took this class with him, I knew it was a memoir. I knew that it was a memoir about separating from an oppressive situation, from the mother, from the country. Also after, in 2004, after that first workshop with him, the voice of the memoir changed, the voice of the book changed. It became more ironic, I think. It was, of course I wanted to be like Frank McCourt, right? Mm-hmm. Everyone wants to be like Frank McCourt if you're writing a memoir. The voice changed, and it sort of congealed, it all congealed into what the book is now, into A Mountain of Crumbs.
What about writing it was the most difficult for you?
Probably, it was very, writing is difficult, as we all know, but the most difficult scene, I think, was my father's death. My father died when I was 10. He died of cancer, and I didn't know it back then, but he died quickly over maybe several weeks. And I was the one who made, he was in the hospital. My mother, who was an anatomy professor, pulled all her connections to put him into hospital, and they wouldn't admit him because he was going to die and it would raise their mortality rates. But finally she knocked on the door of every party boss in Leningrad. My father was a party member, and finally they accepted him for a week. They said, we'll take him for a week. And children were not allowed into hospitals back then in Russia. So we talked on the phone, just called and found out how he was. Not to him, there were no phones in the rooms. And I was the one who made that phone call. I called, and the clerk said, oh, you know, what's the name? I told her the name, said, oh, died last night. So that was the first story I wrote, now that I think back, but it was the most difficult thing to put down on paper.
I can imagine that. Oh. Let's talk a little bit about how the book has been received, and especially maybe some of the Russians that you've encountered at readings, and how they've talked to you about it.
Well, I look at people write me letters, and most of them are, you know, I get them on my website, they write emails. And there are sort of 3 groups of people who write these very intense reactions to the book. One group consists of people like me who were born and raised in the Soviet Union, came here about the same generation, and for them it's sort of reliving their own life, and a lot of them tell me it's very difficult. It's difficult to be reminded of that's where we grew up. The second group is the children of these people, who perhaps were born in this country, or perhaps came here when they were children, and they do not speak Russian as their first language. They are Americans, but yet they have that connection and they want to know about their parents' lives. And then there are also people who travel to Russia or to the Soviet Union and sort of recognize certain things that are in the book that they could connect to. Well, these are sort of this biggest, I would say, readers with these intense reactions to the book. but sometimes they come to readings, and I've given a number of readings, and they come to readings and they ask interesting questions. And some of them are sort of, maybe they're just testing me and asking, you know, oh, is she for real? Do you remember this? Do you remember that?
Do you remember one of the best ones you've gotten?
One of the best ones. Well, weren't you there? You were there in the audience. You know what? I was a little oblivious. What was it? You tell me.
I can't remember exactly, but they were almost challenging you, like you said. And what about this small detail? And, you know, when I was there, this is how it happened. And, you know, when we were online for things, they were very, but as you say, very much saying, are you the real deal? Is this exactly how things happened?
And then, and I think, but at the end, yes, I remember that. And at the end, they sort of thought that it was real. They identified with it. And I think the reason itself that they asked those questions was probably because it sort of affected them very deeply to begin with. Otherwise, why would they even, you know, come to this reading? Or why would they even bother asking this question? I think it was almost, the question sounded like a challenge perhaps to me, or sort of this testing. But the reason I think they asked the question in the first place was because it was visceral. They you know, something in the book affected them viscerally.
Kelly Jones gave a talk a couple days ago which talked about how to start the book. How did you know where to start your memoir, or did you have different beginnings that you rejected?
I didn't know. I had no idea. It is my first book, and I really I didn't know where to start it, and it took me a long time to figure out where to start this memoir. And what I had in front of me, and I am, you know, sort of self-taught, I guess, because I'm not in the MFA program, and English is my second language. But what was in front of me when I was in Frank McCourt's class that first year, 2004, was his work. In front of me was Agile as Ashes, so I took Agile as Ashes and I looked at how he started it. And he started it with the first 20 pages is before he's even born. He started it with the story of his parents and how his parents met, and then he's born somewhere on page 22. And now that I look back and look at my book, I did exactly the same thing. I started with the story of my mother, and my mother has had a fantastic story. She wrote it down for me, actually. She was always very keen on and very interested in telling her stories to her family, mostly. So she was telling the stories, just, you know, talking, and then I asked her to write them down for me. And she did. She just sat down and wrote in this school notebook. She just wrote down by hand, of course, what happened to her, you know, different stories. And they were just extraordinary. She, you know, I realized she was married 3 times, it turned out. My father was her 3rd husband.
You didn't know that?
I knew she was, I thought she was married twice because my sister had a different father, I knew that. But then there was another one, there was the first marriage, very quick, very impulsive. Both her first marriages were very impulsive, maybe because it was the war, it was World War II, and before the war and right during the war. And she wrote everything down, and she wrote down her stories. She was a surgeon during World War II, worked on the front line. Some incredible, just incredible stories, and I wanted to tell them, and the only way I knew how to do it was to start with her stories. So the first chapter and the second chapter is my mother's story, and then she marries my father at the end of chapter 2, and then I'm born, and then it goes into first person. But the first 2 chapters are in the 3rd person. It's about her. And as far as I knew, it was all wrong. as you know, as Kaylee Jones said, well, you know, you don't do that really, but it works in this case. But all I knew was that Frank McCourt taught us in that class that the best way to write a memoir is chronological order. He said if you don't do that, it sort of becomes a gimmick. And if you want to be real, just write it the way it happened. And that's what I did.
Tell me a little bit about the path to getting A Mountain of Crumbs published.
It was actually it happened very fast. After that memoir with Frank McCourt in 2004, he allowed me to continue, sort of allowed, I felt that he gave me this authority. He allowed me to be a writer, he sort of validated my writing. And I continued, and very shortly after that, about 4 or 5 chapters of the memoir were published in literary magazines, in Colorado Review, the North American Review, the Southern Review. It was all, you know, all those reviews. And that, of course, that was another validation for me. And then I bought the Writer's Market. I wrote a query letter, as they said I should write a very good query letter, so I spent a month writing a good query letter. And I chose a number of agents from the book, another book on literary agents, and I sent it to them. I knew that there was this legendary agent, Molly Friedrich, who represented Frank McCourt and a number of other very accomplished writers. And at the time, she was not accepting any unsolicited queries. And I knew that. It said right there online. And I was not going to send it to her. And my husband said, what do you have to lose? 41 cents, the stamp, postage. And I wrote to her. I sent her a query letter. And she responded immediately. She was the only one who responded, actually. She responded. She asked if it's finished. And of course it wasn't. I was naive and I didn't know that you're supposed to finish work before you send it to an agent. So she said, well, you know, I don't read anything that's not finished. And I wrote frantically. I wrote the end, the 3 chapters, the 3 last chapters. And then I worked with her assistant for a long time, for several months. I met with her assistant, who pointed out certain weaknesses, suggested certain revisions. And she was absolutely right. I did what she told me to do. I brought it back to her. Then Molly read it. She took it. She revised it again. She told me what needs to be revised, smaller things now. But she said, I'm giving you 2 weeks. Come back with revisions. I did. She liked them. She submitted. And she sold it in about 2 months later.
But overall, you said it took about 15 years for you to write it.
It did.
Right?
Now that I think, when I started writing, the first story, the first chapter that was published in fictional form as a short story in the Virginia Quarterly Review, that was my first publication, it was 1996. So, yes, 15 years.
And what writers have most influenced you as you think about having become a writer?
Oh, goodness. Well, in the Soviet Union, we were all raised, of course, with the Russian writers, and it was all very nationalistic. We didn't know anyone but, you know, the Russian writers. But the Russian writers that we studied in school and then later at the university were, of course, the Russian classics. But a lot of poetry, Russian poets, and the way Russian literature was taught in school in the Soviet Union was we memorized things, and we were told to memorize all the poetry that we were studying. So it was Pushkin, it was Lermontov, it was the prose poems of Turgenev. We were to memorize prose as well, and it was sort of that tradition that we were inundated with. I don't know what it was with this poetry. It was taken for granted that, of course, you have to know this stuff. You have to memorize it. You have to quote it. and you know, in conversations you would quote poetry and prose. So Russians, and there was very little from the West that we contemporary that was allowed to be brought into the Soviet Union, because it was, you know, the Cold War, the Iron Curtain time. But when I came here, oh, of course, we had all the Samizdat and Bulgakov was a huge influence, The Master and Margarita, Russian novel. Nabokov, we couldn't get there, but as soon as I came to this country, it's the first thing I did. I just went and I got Nabokov's work. Pasternak, of course, Dr. Zhivago was not allowed, but we had his poetry, and we knew him as a poet. And then here, it was one of those. It was a shock, I have to say. It was a shock. The choice, everything that sort of avalanched on me, not just in terms of what's available materially, you know, like food and clothes, which was also a shock, but what was available in terms of intellectual knowledge and the books that were available, the film, theater. It was shocking, and it took time to sort of get adjusted to. Contemporary writers, well, Nabokov's peak memory, of course, was something that we couldn't read there, but here, when I read that was very illuminating, and his stories and his novels, of course, too. In terms of contemporary writers, I absolutely in awe of John Coetzee's work, and I know that he's pronounced Coetzee, and Coetzee is, I think, the pronunciation that is the correct Afrikaans pronunciation, but because he spent so much time in this country, I think he calls himself Coetzee. I'm in awe of his work, and that, I don't know if it had any influence, but I certainly read most of it.
And how did you get a blurb from him for your memoir?
I was extremely fortunate, I think that's what it was. It was just luck and fortune and his extreme generosity. My agent, Molly Friedrich, told me what to do. She gave me this spiel. We talked on the phone for about an hour and a half, and she told me, you have to approach writers and get advance quotes from them. She explained what I had to do, and she mentioned, it would never, in a million years, I would never have guts to approach someone like that. But she said, he wrote a novel about Dostoevsky. It's called The Master of Petersburg. It is set in St. Petersburg, my city, and not only that, it is set a few blocks from where I used to live, the Dostoevsky area, close to the center of the city. And of course, and I read it and I reread it, and she said, write to him. He teaches at the university in Australia, find his address at the university and write to him. And I read his work, I found everything on the internet I could find about him, I read all his interviews, and he doesn't give many interviews, as you know. And I tried to make a connection, and the connection I thought was, for me, was that his setting, his understanding, not only of Russia and St. Petersburg in the novel, but also of Dostoevsky's mind and how it worked. And I think The Master of Petersburg is not just about Dostoevsky, I think it's about writing. The same way the seagull, Chekhov's seagull, is about writing. It's about writing and what the writer has to, how deeply a writer has to sort of go inside himself and open himself up, and what comes out, you know, what this blood that comes out. I think that's what the novel is about, and that's what I wrote to him. I made this connection in my letter, and I also told him that he absolutely got everything right in his novel in terms of the setting, in terms of sounds, in terms of smells, mosquitoes. The St. Petersburg is built on a marsh in the delta of the river, of the Neva, and it was absolutely accurate. And I told him that. There were also smaller coincidences. He worked in Austin, Texas. That's where he finished his PhD at the University of Texas at Austin. He was writing about, you know that he's a mathematician as well as, and he was writing, he was analyzing the style of Beckett, I think, using computers, something like that. But he was working at Austin a few years after I was at Austin. That's where I came. I came to this country and I lived in Austin. So it was a small coincidence. But I just told him that I thought he understood our, this twisted, dark Russian minds. And I also included a sample chapter to just, for him to see what kind of writing I was doing, whether he would be interested in it. And he immediately responded. And I calculated. I went to the post office. I sent him this letter, express mail, with a sample chapter, and I calculated the days when he would receive it. Of course, I asked him how long it would take. The day he was supposed to receive it, I got an email from him, which said, "Send me your whole story. Yes, I would like to read your story." And being a naive, first-time writer, I sent him pages from my computer. I was supposed to send him a bound galley. That's what writers read. But I sent him 400 pages from my computer, unedited, basically unedited. They were, edited by me, but not by my editor yet. And it took him just 3 or 4 days to read the whole thing. And he sent me an email with the quote, and he said, "P.S. I hope your editor knows that on page 75 there is a misspelling," or something like that. So he gave me 3 points when, that I should. And I was so happy that it was only 3.
So he gave you a blurb and copy edited.
Yes.
You're saying.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That was before it was published. You sent it to him?
It was before it was. Yes, it was before it was published. I was. It was accepted for publication, but I was collecting the blurbs that they could then put on the back jacket of the book. So it took about a year, I think, between. Yes, it took a year and a half between the time when the book was sold to the time when it came out. And a year of that time I spent about a year collecting quotes.
Talk a little bit about the relationship between the mother and the daughter, you being the daughter, in the memoir, and how you approach that.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, because what I thought I was writing a memoir about growing up in the Soviet Union, and that's what I was writing. When I finished, and when I sort of looked back at it, even after it was published, I realized that it was really about a relationship between this overbearing, controlling mother and motherland, because my mother was a mirror image of my motherland when I was growing, for me. And the book is really about separation. It's about finding yourself. It's about separating from the oppressive situation at home, both in the family and in the country. It's about moving on. It's about societal change, in this case, generational change. And I'm convinced that's what it's about. But it's interesting how it wasn't obvious to me when I was writing it. It was sort of it must have been in the back of my mind, because everyone says that's what it's about now. So it's just these forces at work that we are not even maybe aware of when we write things. But they're present and they become obvious later.
Thank you so much, Elena, for speaking to us today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.